Welcome to the Guardians of Hope podcast, where we bring together parents, nonprofits, legal, and medical experts dedicated to positively impacting children's lives. I'm your host, Cynthia Ramsaran. The thoughts and opinions of my guests are not necessarily my own, so thank you all for joining and sharing. Hey, welcome everyone. Today we're diving into a topic that affects millions of adults worldwide, yet often goes unrecognized and undiagnosed: adult ADHD. While many of us associate ADHD with childhood, the reality is that this neurodevelopmental condition doesn't simply disappear with age. In fact, many adults struggle with ADHD symptoms for years without understanding why they face certain challenges in their daily lives. Joining us today is Billy Roberts, founder and clinical director at Focused Mind ADHD Counseling, who has extensive experience in diagnosing and treating adult ADHD. We'll explore how this condition manifests differently in adults compared to children, discuss the diagnostic process, and share strategies for managing ADHD effectively. Billy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So why don't you tell us a bit about your background and your work experience?
Yeah, so I started Focused Mind ADHD Counseling about 5 years ago. My history in the profession, when I graduated college, I was a double major between theater, actually, and psychology. So quickly, when I moved to New York City and kind of figured out that wasn't for me, I got into more of the psychology side of things, and I got into this great job at the NYU Child Study Center, and it was a holistic treatment center that focused on providing services for kids, many of whom had neurodevelopmental stuff going on, like autism and ADHD. But they really had this holistic model of mental health where they had like workshops and family counseling. And it was kind of there that I developed my passion for ADHD. I also have adult ADHD. So, I'm familiar with how we ADHDers see the world and life. So I got interested in starting my own practice that was ADHD focused because once I got my degrees in mental health and advanced degrees to become a therapist, I quickly developed just a knack for treating ADHD. It was just became sort of like a specialty of mine. And when I moved to Columbus with my wife, I think myself, like a lot of clinicians around the country, were seeing that there was this huge need for adults with ADHD, in particular, the testing for ADHD. A lot of folks are seen for evaluations and the ADHD is completely overlooked or mistaken for something else, or they have co-occurring things going on. It all gets lumped into a different bucket than ADHD. And just in terms of specialized services, so counseling that specifically helps and supports ADHDers. So I started this holistic practice to focus on, the testing for ADHD, counseling for ADHD, couples counseling for ADHD, and can help folks with the co-occurring things that might come up with it, like depression and anxiety and things like that. So yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And you touched a little bit about this, but I want to dive in a little bit more about what prompted the medical community to recognize that ADHD continues into adulthood, and how has this understanding evolved over the years?
Yeah, so in terms of the medical literature, it actually the mention of adult ADHD has been around for centuries. So it actually we first saw people talking about it in the 1700s. And it doesn't really pick up steam in terms of the diagnostic manual in America until the 1960s. But then it's called it's like childhood kinetic syndrome or something like that. So what happens is the reason adults start getting noticed is in the 70s, they start doing longitudinal studies. So there's psychologists that are tracking these kids that were diagnosed in childhood and noticing a lot of them still had ADHD stuff going on in adulthood. It doesn't really start really picking up major steam until the 1990s. That's when it's included in the diagnostic manual and adults can be diagnosed with ADHD. But it's also around the time where research is just really picking up steam. And there's a little bit of a cultural phenomenon going on because this book is released called Driven to Distraction by Dr. Ned Hallowell. It's really famous because it's one of the pioneering texts for the public, where he really gets into why ADHD is different than other stuff. So he gets into the differences between ADHD and depression and anxiety and does a deep dive on it. So why this is really interesting is because medical literature is sort of converging with the public, because all the hundreds of thousands of people were not diagnosed as children, and they're reading this book and they're all coming out of the woodwork saying, hey, I think I have ADHD. And a lot of them turned out to be right. So all these specialty practices started popping up. But, part of the issue was back then is that the childhood specialists were trying to figure out how to support adult ADHD. And I think, ever since that time, we've sort of been trying to rapidly catch up on how ADHD impacts adults, because of this gap in acknowledgement and services that have been going on for so many years. It's evolved in other ways too, in terms of the criteria, and they've lifted a little bit of the age requirement, but it now includes adults as well.
Perfect. Thank you for letting us know about that. And you talked a little bit about childhood and adults realizing, hey, I may have had this, or I may have this. Maybe you could walk us through the key differences between how ADHD presents in children versus adults.
Yeah, so I think the thing to explain so ADHD, essentially the brain's executive functions work differently in ADHD brains than non-ADHD brains, and the executive functions essentially guide your current behavior towards the future. So they're responsible for self-regulation, emotional regulation, impulse control, responsible for keeping you on track in terms of your goals, like not getting off track if you set a goal in the future. Your working memory, so quick recall, sustaining your attention for long periods of time. And the thing to remember about that is that kids develop those executive functions. ADHD kids develop them at a rate 30% behind their peers. So a lot of the times what you see is really dramatic differences sometimes in ADHD children versus non-ADHD children in terms of how they're keeping up with the developmental demands of childhood. So someone might enter middle school and all of a sudden they're struggling to manage homework. They're struggling to, absorb things, get things in on time. You might have a middle schooler who's more, might be having like tantrums and things like that feel like their social emotional development is slightly behind their peers. And sometimes that lasts into young adulthood. So, you might see a lot of young adults who are like, I feel like I'm behind my peers. I feel like I haven't accumulated as many accomplishments. And while that might be true of all young adulthood, it disproportionately affects adults with ADHD. Once you get into like firmly adulthood, all those traits are there. They just look different. And there's not as much of a drastic change in terms of development. It's more situational. So an adult might struggle with things like time management at work. Kids don't really manage their time. The world manages their time. Like teachers manage their time. They're told where to go. They're told where to send the things. But adults, they have to regulate their relationship to their time. So they have to regulate when they start projects, when they do chores, how they do chores, predict how long things will take. And so sometimes that can be one of the major differences between how adults experience it situationally versus in terms of their developmental stages. And then another big one is masking. So adults with ADHD tend to, through social learning, social conditioning, they start to develop insecurities about some of the traits of ADHD. So if someone is known to interrupt people in conversation, they might actually start to avoid social situations because they develop insecurities, or they might become perfectionistic because they're trying to mask any kind of like unintentional errors they would make from losing focus. So sometimes the compensatory strategies can also even lead to secondary conditions like depression and anxiety, disproportionately more so in adults.
Got it. Thank you. What typically brings adults in? You mentioned the presentations, how, some of the traits or symptoms.
Yeah.
What actually brings an adult in for an ADHD evaluation? Are there common life events or situations that tend to trigger seeking diagnosis?
A lot of the times it is transitions. So someone's first job out of grad school, or, they have kids, or they're getting married, or they got a promotion at work, they're entering leadership positions, they start their own business and they're struggling with the details, but they're really good at the creative side of things. A lot of the times it might be a spouse. So, a lot of times ADHDers will find that their executive functioning stuff, they're able to manage a home environment. They'll say things like, it's organized chaos. So like you might think it's disorganized, you might see piles and different things, but I know where everything is. However, if they start to domesticate and they move in with someone whose brain works in a more linear neurotypical way, those things might create tension because someone else is just a little bit better at like the organizational things or has a different style for doing it. So over the years, those kinds of how couples start to manage life the differences might start to become more apparent. And I think, the more ADHD is out there and the more people are learning about it, sometimes it's a spouse or a good friend or someone in their personal lives. It's like, hey, have you ever noticed that this is stuff that you do? And because ADHDers don't experience ADHD as a symptom, they often just think that that's how everyone's brain works. Not that it is a symptom per se, but it's a difference in terms of neurotypical behavior.
Mm-hmm. You talked about linear, the way the brain works, two different ways. You said linear, and then you said neurodivergent. Can you just briefly explain what the difference is so everyone knows?
Yeah, so neurodiversity is the idea that we're all, there's that ADHD, we'll take ADHD. It's just a different way of experiencing the world neurologically, that we all just have differences neurologically. And so for ADHDers, it's not that they don't have an attention span, it's a dysregulated attention span. So their brains almost have too much attention. Like they want to be everywhere. They want to see things, they consume things, they like new things, they like creativity. And so that causes outwardly, you might see zigging and zagging. So a lot of like, this is really interesting. I'm kind of over this. I'm going to start this new thing. And someone who without ADHD has a different way of their executive functioning working, where they kind of like build momentum towards a goal and they just kind of can build each day on top of the next. And so as a result, they don't get as sidetracked.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for explaining that.
Sure.
So let's talk about the evaluation process for adult ADHD. What can someone expect when seeking a diagnosis?
Yeah, so the first thing you're looking for is a specialist. I think just because of our field's history and how we're all catching up, I think it really does take someone who does this, and this is what they do, to give you the most accurate diagnosis. So once you find that specialist, the ADHD evaluation process usually takes about 2 to 3 hours. There's usually a couple of different steps. To differentiate it from other conditions, you need to do what they call a multi-data assessment. So one thing you might do is you give rating scales and questionnaires, or have someone who knows them well come with them to the evaluation. This is because folks with ADHD tend to underreport symptoms or their traits. So they might not always be 110% aware of some of the things that they do that might be different and might meet criteria for ADHD. The next thing you're going to do is administer rating scales and questionnaires to them. So what those rating scales are measuring are executive functions, and they're normed between the neurotypical population and the ADHD population. So you're trying to see if those scores align repetitively with individuals in the ADHD world, to see if those folks struggle with executive functioning stuff more than the neurotypical population. You're then going to do a thorough interview. And so the thing to recognize is that all people at points of their lives might have differences in their executive functioning, and they might have challenges in their terms of their focus. But ADHD has a developmental course. So it's the entire life course is in some way affected and could get different and change, or they could have trouble with focus in different ways based on their circumstances. But it's always something that's been happening, since childhood. And then you also should expect some sort of objective tests. There's lots of different ones you could do. There is no one test that's perfect at diagnosing ADHD. That's why we do a multi-data assessment to look at all of it and put the pieces together with a lot of different data. So the objective testing could be like a focusing test or an attention span test that helps to, similarly to the rating scales, differentiate neurotypical versus ADHD type behaviors as it exists in the room. Like, so how they perform in terms of their focus and impulse control in person.
Okay. Now, when being looked after by a mental health specialist or professional, how can they differentiate between ADHD and other conditions that might present similar symptoms, maybe like anxiety or depression?
Yeah, so I think the major one is that, if someone is ADHD and they have depression, they're going to focus worse. They're going to have more focusing issues versus someone who has depression. They might also struggle with focusing issues, but when that depression lifts, they won't have the ADHD traits anymore. Like they're not going to be affected long-term in the same way that someone with ADHD is. So it follows a chronic course. and it's in existence no matter what. The life course, what's really helpful about adult ADHD is that kids can't self-advocate. Like a kid can't say clearly the way an adult can, like, this is the past 30 years of my life, this is what's happened to me. And an adult can. They have lots of stories to tell. ADHDers, there's like lots of things that have happened. So we have a term in mental health called look for elephants in the butter. So like if an elephant raids a fridge and they raid your kitchen and then they leave, you're going to know that something happened in that kitchen. Like it's not going to just look the way it did. And so those are the types of things we're looking for. Like, did someone change jobs multiple times because they got bored? Did they get the boss say that they had trouble turning things in on time or seem distracted? Do they feel deeply unhappy when they're doing things that are too mundane? And are they kind of ashamed of these things that really light them up and they're passionate about, but actually they would set the world on fire if they leaned in and embraced, who they really are and what their interests were. So you do see stuff that happens in people's history that's very unique to ADHD.
Okay. That was a great analogy. Thank you. Okay, so we talked a lot about diagnosis and understanding what the traits are like. How does undiagnosed adult ADHD typically impact various aspects of life? Obviously, undiagnosed or diagnosed, it's going to impact your life the same way. But if you don't know you have it and you can't cope or address what's happening, it can affect your career, relationships, personal well-being. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So if you think about domains of functioning, you would see stuff happening in different parts of life. So if it was work, maybe your boss is getting on your case for struggling to meet deadlines. Maybe they are talking about time management issues and things like that. You might often feel like you haven't met your potential, like you've been overlooked, like you're capable of more or something different, or you're not as happy as you could be, but you feel like you can't seem to find your way. This can happen a lot in careers. So, one of the things about ADHD is that you might have a hard time with the details and activating and procrastinating even on the stuff that isn't as interesting to you. So like invoicing or getting an LLC. So if you want to start a business, a lot of people with ADHD have really great ideas for businesses. They have lots of ideas. It's just hard to get the momentum and get things off the ground. Marital stuff. So like a lot of ADHD gets misinterpreted by spouses. If you don't know that, if the couple doesn't know that one person is ADHD, then forgetfulness might be interpreted as apathy or like cruelty even. So what happens then is that all of that stuff compounds over the years, and ultimately probably the biggest part, the most amount of suffering I see comes from self-esteem issues. So there can be a lot of toxic shame when it comes to ADHD, a lot of imposter syndrome, a lot of feeling like you can't be who you really are. It affects your ability to assert yourself in the world, to put yourself out there, to take risks, to set boundaries with people. You often find ADHDers will overcommit and be yes people. One part of that is like a reflexive, like, yes, I can do it. Yes, I can do it. I'll do it, because you don't want to be in trouble, but also that you feel like you have to make up for something all the time. Like you often develop this core belief of you're not good enoughness, usually coming from repetitive criticism that you've received in childhood. Like you only do good when you want to, you don't apply yourself. Like, look at your brother, he's doing all this stuff and you're not. And you'd be astonished at the kinds of things that people with ADHD hear of their lives. So ultimately, until you get that diagnosis and you don't know you have a brain that works differently, and you can do great things in this world if you just figure out the best ways to live life as an ADHD person. You tend to moralize stuff. Like you don't even know what to call it. You just feel not good enough and you feel broken, rather than feeling liberated and feeling like you can be yourself and you're worthy of love and all that stuff. And you can set boundaries and you can manage your time. And then all the coping skills and the strategies just click into place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And you talked about coping strategies.
Yeah.
Why don't we talk about treatment and coping strategies? Maybe we can group it together, but what are some of the effective coping strategies you've seen adults develop over the years? And even you as a professional helping adults learn to develop, after a diagnosis?
Yeah. So a lot of the times folks luck out and they have either found the right relationship where they're receiving the love that helps them feel supported. And that's an ideal situation. If we can start there, that's great. And sometimes folks have found the right career. So they've built their life around their interests. So maybe you see an entrepreneur, people with ADHD, you name it, doctors, lawyers, whatever professional, if they're interested, that interest can carry them through. And so they can be very successful in life. Like you can be a high achiever and have ADHD. In terms of the coping, though, it really just depends on each person and what works for them and what doesn't. Some of the therapy for ADHD in particular would focus on both the skills and the way of managing a brain that just needs some help strategies to focus better or differently. But also the emotional stuff. So helping folks work through the shame, work through the imposter syndrome, feel confident. Some things you might see folks learn to do that are self-compassion tools and things like that. But in terms of managing the neurological components, a lot of it is about externalizing things. So externalizing motivation, having accountability, getting yourself activated because there's something outside of yourself that's keeping you in place or holding you accountable. Offloading things. So a lot of times entrepreneurs will have ADHD and they'll be so great at writing the thing or doing that special part of the job or the leadership stuff. And there might be, they might need some support on the invoicing or things like that. And so let's get them that support. Let's offload as much of the stuff that's weighing down or feeling overwhelming. A lot of it's about chunking things down, breaking things down into smaller parts, things that are more manageable, ways of talking to yourself or literally writing things down so that things can just feel more doable. Having fun is a big part of having ADHD. A brain that loves excitement and loves energy cannot be deprived of drinking that. It's like taking away water. So like ADHDers need to be planful in terms of like how they have fun, where they get their creative energy going, having a hobby, having a passion project. That's that part where you're really practicing self-acceptance and leaning into ADHD rather than fighting it all the time. That's where you get the shame. That's where you get the discouragement. So a big part of ADHD, treatment tends to be managing emotions. Like, how can we manage the guilt? How can we manage the shame and the fear so that you can show up and be your best self and be present in the moment? And life doesn't have to feel so overwhelming when you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about medical treatment? What types of treatment options are available and what are you excited about?
Yeah. So the medical stuff, that would be more in the world of medication, like psychopharmacology. The way I view that is it's a coping skill. At the end of the day, the model of ADHD treatment is very, you always like, it's not a disease model where you might think of it like a pneumonia or like taking a medicine for a cure. It's just like a boost. Like it gives your brain an energy boost a lot of the times and helps you focus when you're on it. But you always have ADHD, like even when you're off of it or you don't take it at some point in your life. So I look at it as a supportive tool, in general. Nothing anyone has to do if they don't want to, unless there's a lot of dysfunction going on or, they really need that support for some period of their lives. But it is really effective. It's a proven intervention. I think a psychiatrist would be better equipped to explain the different types. But it is, in terms of psychiatry, a very treatable, you can get support that way.
Okay. And then what about behavioral treatments?
Yeah. So a lot of that is managing the environment. So like, do you have an environment that's conducive to how your brain works? And are you becoming your own self-advocate? I think that's honestly a missing part of a lot of treatment for ADHD is that there's one thing to seek accommodations in a formal way, but I think a lot of folks with ADHD struggle with so much rejection sensitivity and feeling of disempowerment that they don't feel empowered to ask for what they need and to ask for help. So some of it is like, what would actually help in this situation? Like, do you need your own office? Like, do you need like someone to meet with you once a month? And I think you'd be surprised at how understanding your boss, whatever it is, might be if you just kind of were upfront about some of what your needs might be. And then in terms of the cognitive behavioral stuff, a lot of that is managing emotions. Adults with ADHD, it's not in the diagnostic criteria, but it's a big part of living life with ADHD where self-regulation impacts emotional regulation. So a lot of times adults with ADHD don't recognize how they feel and they have a hard time regulating how they feel and having a stopgap between emotion and response. So a lot of it, what happens then is the emotions almost become distractions in of themselves. So you get gobbled up. So if you're someone who has self-esteem stuff, you might feel shame and guilt a lot. That gobbles up the lens at which you see the world. And if that's how you're seeing the world, you're automatically going to anticipate rejection. So you might not put yourself out there as much. So some of the CBT stuff comes up and the behavioral stuff and helping people work through that so they can reframe how they're thinking about things or regulate their emotions so that then all their strengths and their unique, the unique parts of ADHD that actually serve them, they can put those to use.
Okay. Really, I have one more question for you, and that's just how we can learn more. So what resources would you recommend for adults who think they might have ADHD or were recently diagnosed?
Yeah. So in terms of wanting to know if you have it, there are online quizzes and things like that. And I know we live in a culture of quizzes and everyone's trying to tell you you have something, but for this, I'm all in. I think folks should take a quiz, and it's not a diagnosis, but if you have a score that's elevated, or if you're seeing these things, or you're reading a book about ADHD, you're like, this is my life, then you might be in that category of people in the 90s who read Dr. Ned Hallowell's book and read all about it because you're not, no one ever said anything to you as a kid. So sometimes you have to like do your own research and realize and recognize that could be what's going on for you. In terms of resources for if you've just been diagnosed, I think the warmest and most welcoming people, honestly, are some of these influencers online who they might not even be doctors, but they're people who understand on a deeper level what ADHD is like. They have ADHD and they can share with you some of their like life hacks and things like that. My favorite one, Jessica McCabe is her name. She's got one called How to ADHD. She's all over YouTube. She's amazing. She's a very charismatic and very thoughtful, and she interviews specialists and things like that. But I think because she's speaking at it from the heart, it really seems to land for folks in a way, because it really does take someone who knows ADHD, the lived experience, that really helps to make the connection and make some of those skills more accessible.
Okay. Really, thank you. Now, how can we learn more about you and what you're doing, and how anyone can get in touch with you if they'd like to?
Yeah, I'm over at focusmindadhdcounseling.com. We've got a team of folks, so a lot of different counselors who understand ADHD on a personal level. We can see folks in the state of Ohio right now, but you're always welcome to reach out and say hi. We have like a blog and things, so we're out there.
Excellent. Really, it was so great to meet you and shed light on this topic. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you got it. Thanks. Take care. Thanks for having me.